A Boeing 737 filled with 127 people begins falling from the sky in the middle of a thunderstorm. As the passengers scream, the pilots struggle desperately to control their jet. How have they gotten into this life and death situation, and will they be able to get out of it? This is the story of Bhoja Air Flight 213. On the evening of April 20th, 2012, 121 passengers and 6 crew boarded a Boeing 737 at Karachi in Pakistan. Flight 213 was being operated by Bhoja Air, and it was something of a special flight, being the airline's inaugural service from Karachi to the capital city of Islamabad. The journey was expected to take about 2 hours. Every seat on board was full. Even in the cockpit, an off-duty cabin crew member was hitching a ride in the jump seat behind the pilots. But despite the apparently auspicious occasion, the stage was already set for disaster. Over at Islamabad, storms were brewing, creating conditions which the two pilots were not remotely trained to deal with. In fact, these pilots were so poorly trained that they hadn't even been taught how to fly this particular aircraft, the advanced version of the 737-200. All of their training and even the manuals on board the aircraft were from an older version of the plane. That version had a much less sophisticated autopilot and other less advanced systems. All the pilots knew was that this plane was more high-tech, but they hadn't been trained on the details of this newer technology. As a result, they overestimated the aircraft's abilities. On this evening, this overestimation would have deadly consequences. The pilots were 58-year-old Captain Nurullah Khan Afridi and 53-year-old First Officer Javed Malik. The captain was a former Air Force pilot with more than 10,000 hours of flying experience. He had been flying 737s for several years with a different airline before switching to Bhoja Air earlier that year. The first officer was also a former Air Force pilot, although he was less experienced, with just short of 3,000 hours of flying time under his belt. He had worked for the same airline as the captain had previously, and had followed him over to Bhoja Air once he switched. The two pilots were friends, and had been paired together on more than half of the flights they had flown with the new airline so far. But later this day, as the plane approached Islamabad, that relationship would be put under strain when Captain Afridi began to make a series of bad decisions. Just before 5 o'clock that evening, the doors were closed and Flight 213 pushed back from the gate at Karachi. Despite the pilots' generally high level of experience, they each had only 80 hours on this specific version of the 737-200. The captain had previously begun training on a more modern version of the 737 at his last airline, but this training was discontinued after his supervisors deemed him unable to operate the automated flight deck in a safe and efficient manner. Of course, the 121 passengers were completely unaware that the crew with whom they had entrusted their lives were not up to the job. But before long, the whole country would find this out. At 5 minutes past 5, Flight 213 powered into the skies above Karachi and began its climb to 31,000 feet. For the first hour, everything went to plan. The flight progressed north along its route, and the pilots chatted casually amongst themselves. There was little weather to contend with at cruise altitude, and the passengers were able to enjoy the views out their windows as the sun began to set over the countryside. But this semblance of normality was only skin deep, because, as it would soon emerge, the aircraft they were flying on should never have been allowed to carry passengers in the first place. And that's because, as far as Pakistan's Civil Aviation Authority was concerned, Bhoja Air didn't have any advanced versions of the 737-200. They thought the fleet consisted solely of the base model 737. Indeed, Bhoja Air's pilot training program reflected this. Pilots were only trained to fly the base model 737-200, not the advanced version. And it went further than that, because it wasn't just what the Civil Aviation Authority, or CAA, didn't know that was a problem, but what they did know. The CAA had allowed Bhoja Air to operate this particular plane even though they hadn't granted its certificate of airworthiness to carry passengers. And, what's more, some would later claim that senior officials at the airline had engaged in some under-the-table dealings with the CAA to allow the airline itself to operate in the first place. In other words, the story of Bhoja Air Flight 213 is a story involving layer after layer of corruption. The Swiss cheese model by psychologist James Pearson is often used to explain aircraft accidents. The idea goes that accidents happen when the layers of safety, represented here by the cheese slices, have holes in them, which, on some unfortunate occasions, line up in such a way as to allow an accident to happen. Naturally, the way to prevent similar accidents in future is to add more layers of safety, and to close up some of the holes. But as we're beginning to see, at Bhoja Air, the Swiss cheese model looked a lot more like this. So, while Flight 213 looked like any other plane, and flew like any other plane, the entire infrastructure which supported it was badly lacking. But the bureaucrats and businessmen who arranged this state of affairs were not on board Flight 213. And so, at 10 minutes past 6, when the aircraft began its descent into Islamabad, it was the passengers and crew who would have to contend with their corruption. By this point, the conversation in the cockpit was focused mainly on the weather. The pilots could see on their onboard weather radar that powerful storms were building in front of them. The captain told the passengers that there may be some rain and light turbulence during the approach. However, he was more direct with the flight attendants, telling them to expect a lot of bumps. Despite the weather, the atmosphere in the cockpit was laid back, with the captain singing songs and the first officer mocking his singing ability. But it could reasonably be asked whether this laid-back attitude was verging on the cavalier. The storms at Islamabad were significant. There was thunder and lightning, heavy rain, and strong winds. As the pilots got closer, they could see just how intense these storms were on their weather radar. It was beginning to look like they might need to go to one of their alternate airports. Since the weather in the first of their alternate airports, Lahore, was bad, the first officer suggested that they check the weather in their second alternate airport of Peshawar. But the captain dismissed this idea, saying that God would help them make it into Islamabad. Even at Bhoja Air, pilots were trained to trust their instruments, and not fate or faith. But the first officer was not about to question his friend, a man he looked up to, and with whom he had a mentor-mentee relationship. So, apparently with the grace of God, Flight 213 continued descending into the murky weather surrounding Islamabad. Ahead of the plane, the pilots could see what is known as a squall line, a series of storms stretching across a long distance. On the other side of the squall line lay the airport. The first officer pointed out the line of storms to the captain, who began thinking out loud about whether it might be better to go around the storm and to try and approach the airport from another direction. He told the air traffic controller at Islamabad that he couldn't see any gap in the line of storms, and asked whether he could try to approach the airport from the west instead. He was hoping that the controller's radar might be showing a gap in the weather that he couldn't see from his current position. But the controller told him that while there was no gap to the west of the airport, there was one to the southwest. However, it was narrow. In fact, it was too narrow. The pilots had been taught not to fly within 5 miles of a thunderstorm, and yet this gap in the storm was much smaller than this, and it was closing in. Nonetheless, the captain decided to press on. This was the small airline's first flight from Karachi to Islamabad, and he was feeling the pressure of making sure that it all went off without a hitch. But this cavalier attitude was about to put him in a position that he would find it very hard to get out of. To bring this back to the Swiss cheese model, Afridi had already passed through the first layer of protection when he ignored the standard operating procedures around storms. Now, as he continued, there would be fewer and fewer safeguards against an accident. Despite the growing pressure, the atmosphere on board was still calm. The plane hadn't encountered any rain or bad turbulence yet, and the captain began engaging the controller in casual conversation over the radio. Meanwhile, the off-duty cabin crew member in the jump seat began lighting up a cigarette. But as the plane descended, the storm got more intense. Flashes of lightning began to light up the cockpit, and the turbulence picked up. The runway was now 15 miles away, and the weather radar showed that the centre of the storms was 14 miles away, right on top of the airport. The first officer pointed this out, hoping that the captain would reconsider his plans to press on to Islamabad. But Afridi was determined to make this approach work, and before long, he wouldn't even have to concern himself with whether he wanted to divert, because in a few moments, he would come face to face with the possibility that he might not even be able to. At that moment, rain began to hit the windscreen, its hiss drowning out most of the cockpit noise. the gap in the storms they had begun to fly through was fast closing in. But the pilots powered on and continued to set the plane up for landing. Things would now start to happen very quickly on board Flight 213. The plane turned to line up with the runway. It was being bumped around, and the autopilot was keeping it on course. The first officer lowered the flaps to the first notch and extended the landing gear. For the passengers and flight attendants, this was a cue that they would all soon be on the ground. But just as the wheels lowered, the plane suddenly encountered a strong headwind. This led to a rapid increase in the plane's airspeed. The autothrottle struggled to respond in time to this increase in airspeed, and it brought the throttles back to keep the speed under control. The first officer pointed out that their speed was 220 knots, way faster than they should have been flying. In fact, it was a full 30 knots faster than the flaps were designed for, putting them at risk of structural damage. The captain was taken aback by this. He was confused about how the autothrottles would let such a thing happen. The captain's surprise is the first clue that in his head was a completely false picture of what was happening. He thought that this rapid increase in airspeed was a result of the autothrottle mismanaging the aircraft's speed. In truth, it was not the plane that had accelerated, but the wind outside the plane. Neither pilot knew it, but they were approaching one of the most dangerous aspects of a thunderstorm: a microburst. As far as aircraft are concerned, there's nothing micro about a microburst. It's a fast ascending mass of air which falls out of a cloud, hits the ground, and spreads out in all directions. Flight 213 was now entering the first part of this phenomenon, the part of the air that was spreading out from this impact with the ground. This sudden headwind caused a substantial increase in the plane's airspeed, in this case from about 190 knots to 220 knots. But from the cockpit, it was hard for the pilots to see that the wind had caused this. They were surrounded by dark clouds, and their only sense of what their plane was doing was given by their instruments. And their instruments couldn't tell them that they were entering a microburst. All they could tell them was that they were now moving much faster through the air. Naturally, the pilots, or in this case the autothrottle, responded to this increase in airspeed by reducing the power on the engines. The pilots had set a target speed of 170 knots on the autopilot, and that's the speed that the autothrottle was trying to reach. After a few moments, the plane reached this airspeed, and normality again resumed. But the pilot's troubles were only just beginning, because microbursts contain not just one rapid change in wind direction, but three. And the latter two are far more dangerous than the first. The two pilots were clueless about what was in store for them next. And what's worse, they had not even been trained to escape the grip of this weather phenomenon. Moments after the flight passed through the headwind part of the microburst, it encountered a much more terrifying component: the downdraft. The pilots were taken by surprise, as the fast downward moving column of air suddenly pulled the plane towards the ground. The autopilot pitched the nose up, trying to prevent the plane from losing too much altitude. But it was no good. The force of the air was too strong. In a matter of seconds, the plane had dropped 1,000 feet. The plane's automated voice shouted out,
"Wind shear."
The captain shouted, "No, no,"
Wind shear.
as the plane
Wind shear.
fell rapidly from the
Wind
sky.
shear. Wind shear.
At their low altitude, on final approach, there wasn't much space left between them and the ground. They needed to get out now. The first officer shouted at the captain to go around. But just as the plane reached 900 feet, it emerged from the terrifying downdraft. The rapid descent had stopped, but the pilots were shaken. The aircraft was now below the glide slope, and it had drifted off to the left of the runway centerline. The pilots had flown unwittingly, but deliberately, into the heart of a deadly thunderstorm, and they were now increasingly in a position that they didn't know how to get out of. The autopilot had disconnected, and the captain was now in control of the plane's flight path. However, he lacked control over one crucial part of the plane: the engines. The autothrottle was still connected, and trying to maintain a speed of 170 knots. What the captain didn't know was that this was all the autothrottle could do. It worked the same as cruise control in a car, simply maintaining the speed that had been set for it. It wasn't going to increase his speed when the pilots desperately needed it, or do anything else to save the aircraft from a dire situation. The passengers were terrified by the aircraft's violent movements, but without any clue about what was going on in the cockpit, they had no idea quite how much danger they were in. And that's when the next part of the microburst began to strike, the most deadly component of all, the tailwind. With the autothrottle trying to keep the speed at 170 knots, a tailwind of 30 knots suddenly knocked the plane's airspeed back to 140 knots, dangerously close to a stall speed. The captain could see that his airspeed was now getting dangerously low, so he pitched the nose down to increase speed. At this point, he could easily have escaped this dangerous situation by pushing the engines to full power and climbing away from the storm. But he was confused, disoriented, and had begun to panic. The controller, not realizing that the plane was in trouble, told the pilots to contact tower control. Captain Afridi screamed at the first officer to handle the radios, while he desperately tried to control the plane. The aircraft continued to descend. It was now getting dangerously low to the ground, and it was still miles out from the runway. Suddenly, the ground proximity warning alarm sounded. Incredibly, neither pilot reacted to this. The correct response was to apply full power and pull the nose up to get away from the ground. But this never happened. With every second, the speed decreased, and the plane got lower and lower to the ground. Then, suddenly, the plane's airspeed began to increase. On the surface, this was good news. Speed was exactly what the plane needed at this moment. But the truth was that this increase in speed happened for the same reason it had happened moments ago. The plane was now entering the headwind phase of its second microburst, and this one was even stronger than the first. The autothrottle reduced the engine thrust, trying to keep the speed at 170 knots. This is exactly what had happened the first time round, but the pilots were none the wiser. They hadn't been trained on how to recognize and escape this dangerous phenomenon. And, just like it had the first time, within a matter of seconds, the headwind turned into a powerful downdraft. The engines were still at low power from the headwind and were unable to spool up quickly enough to stop the plane's speed from dropping. The aircraft began to descend rapidly towards the ground, and for a second time, the ground proximity warning alarm sounded. The captain pulled the nose up sharply, in a desperate attempt to arrest the plane's descent. But incredibly, he didn't push the thrust levers forwards at all. He had badly overestimated the autothrottle, assuming that it would join him in his efforts to power the plane out of its plunge. In reality, all it did was try sluggishly to keep the speed at 170 knots, a speed which, in any case, was too slow to safely get through a microburst. Now, with the engines on low power, the speed decreasing, and the plane falling ever closer to the ground, the captain had just seconds to save his plane. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the plane punched through the edge of the downdraft and entered the dreaded tailwind part of the microburst. Now, the aircraft was truly in a critical position. Its nose was high, its speed was low, and the air was coming over the wings not from above as it had been during the downdraft, but from in front. The smooth flow of air which had held the plane in the sky now detached from the top surface of the wing. With nothing to hold it in the air, the plane began to stall, dropping from the sky. In the cockpit, the stick shaker rattled the pilot's control columns, alerting them to the aerodynamic stall. The captain responded to this correctly, pitching the nose down in a bid to get the air to flow smoothly over the wings again. Pushing the nose down went against all of his instincts, as the plane was now very close to the ground, and there wasn't much room to recover. But for a moment, it worked. The aircraft began accelerating, but because the captain hadn't disconnected the autothrottle, it began reducing power on the engines, trying to keep the plane's speed at 170 knots. At the very moment when the plane most desperately needed speed, the autothrottle tried to slow it down. And then, the ground proximity warning alarm sounded again. The captain was now in a desperate battle with this plane. He was pulling the nose up to keep away from the ground, but when he did, the speed dropped, and he began to stall. When this happened, he pushed the nose down to recover, but then the ground proximity warning sounded, and he pulled the nose up. This deadly rollercoaster ride continued as the plane switched between stalling and falling. With each cycle, it was getting closer to the ground. The solution to this deadly situation was simple. All the pilots had to do was apply full power to the engines and climb away from the danger. But panicked and confused, with alarms blaring, and with completely inadequate training to deal with the situation, the pilots floundered. The throttles, the one thing that could save them from this situation, remained untouched. Seeing how close they now were to the ground, the first officer shouted at the captain to go round. It was the right call, but it was too late. There was simply no altitude left. Flight 213 ploughed into an embankment and shattered to pieces, scattering its wreckage and occupants across the streets of the village below. There were no survivors. Tragically, the lessons of Flight 213 aren't really lessons at all. It shouldn't come as a lesson to anybody that pilots should be trained on the specific version of the aircraft they fly, and that they should be aware of the scope and limitations of its automation. It shouldn't be a lesson that pilots should be trained to recognise and avoid the most deadly weather phenomena they are likely to encounter. And perhaps above all, it should not be a lesson that aviation authorities must carefully vet all airlines, which are profit-oriented businesses, before allowing them to carry passengers. The reason commercial aviation is so safe today is that lessons such as these were learned over decades of accidents and close calls. All of these lessons had been learned well before the crash of Bhoja Air Flight 213 in the year 2012. So what we're left with here is a crash that didn't need to happen, and which resulted in safety recommendations which only applied to Bhoja Airlines, which, as it happens, went out of business anyway shortly after the accident. For this reason, the needless crash of Flight 213 can only serve as a reminder of how dependent modern commercial aviation is on the rules, regulations, and strict standards which apply at all levels of the massive infrastructure which allows planes to fly. If you found this video interesting, you can support the channel by joining the link at the bottom of this screen, and if you'd like to watch more of these videos, I put a playlist just up here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.